you. I am Willie Lightfoot, City Council Vice President. I'm joined with President Scott, who's joined via phone, and all of the rest of our council members, some of our staff, and of course, Madam Mayor and her staff. Today is a briefing to discuss recent events from protesting and civil unrest. And at this time, I will turn it over to Madam Mayor and/or whom she designates.
Council Vice President Lightfoot, I believe that we're here to answer questions that council has. So if you want to present the question, someone on our team will answer.
Very well. Are we doing the same format we did before, BJ, where you read the questions out, or are there individual questions by council members?
I believe that the first question was to have an update about the police and protester engagement over the nights since our last briefing.
Okay. So, Madam Mayor, or someone from the police staff, can they give a briefing to talk about different activities that have happened around protesting and the police interaction since our last meeting to this present moment, please?
I believe that RPD is on the line, so they can give you that information.
Thank you.
Vice President, can you hear me?
Yes, sir, I can hear you loud and clear. Thank you, sir. Welcome.
Thanks. This is Chief Singletary. I'm joined by Deputy Chief Morabito, Deputy Chief Simmons, Deputy Chief Mura, Commander Correa, and Commander Favor, and Commander Rivera. Starting with, as what was asked, starting with Thursday, September 10th, we had a protest around 7 p.m. A crowd size of approximately 150 protesters gathered in front of 584 Jefferson Avenue. That night, the group remained there at that location. The protest was peaceful, and there were no issues to report that night. And I think the protest ended that night around 11:30 p.m. and it started around 7 o'clock that night.
Stop you for a quick second, Chief, just because I want to put a pin here. In the incidents where the protester was on Jefferson Avenue, where were the police at that time on Jefferson Avenue?
We were not on Jefferson Avenue at all.
Okay.
The protesters blocked the traffic themselves.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. We were in the outskirts of the area, but no special attention from afar.
Thank you.
Yep. On Friday, September 11th, there was another protest, about 250 people, and the group arrived at the Public Safety Building from Martin Luther King Jr. Park, and they just arrived to the Public Safety Building before 10 p.m. The night remained peaceful, and the group disbanded around 11:40 p.m. And this was also the same night that we had a homicide over at Capitol Park. The attendance for the protest was approximately 250 people, and again, there were no incidents that night. On Saturday night, on September 12th, the protest started around 9 p.m. I think it started on Jefferson Avenue. The protesters walked to Child and Wilder Street, and it's approximately about 250 to 300 protesters. Ended around 1:30. There were 3 arrests made that night. The group marched from Jefferson Avenue through the city, arriving at Wilder Street and Child Street at approximately 9:30 p.m. Officers formed a line at Wilder Street and Child Street to keep the protesters from passing over the bridge. The north side of the bridge is where the Child Street Police Station is located, where police-related equipment and vehicles on site at the location. Protesters were using bullhorns that night. At 11 p.m., a few protesters attempted to push past community members, which were the elders in the crowd. So we had elders working that night as well, who were trying to keep the protest peaceful. Some of the protesters moved to within 5 to 10 feet of the officers, at which time it became an officer safety issue with regard to the protesters being within a couple feet of the officers. After numerous verbal warnings that were ignored by the crowd, officers moved in to try to move the crowd a little bit, approximately 20 feet to the other side of the intersection to create more distance for officer safety. During this movement, the officers began to take rocks and bottles and several eggs from the crowd throughout. One arrest was made at that particular point in time. I think the night ended with approximately 3 arrests. And certain times throughout the night, officers continued to take rocks and bottles and have them thrown at them from the crowd. ultimately resulting in the first pepper ball deployment after the rocks and bottles were thrown at the officers and a few eggs. And over the course of a period, the crowd continued to throw eggs at officers for a period of time, and the officers remained in formation and stationary with no response. About 1:30, members started to disband, and while disbanding, they did throw rocks and bottles at some of the officers, and the crowd completely disbanded the area at approximately about 1:40 in the morning. On last night, September 13th, Sunday night, there was a crowd of approximately 150 people. They marched from Martin Luther King Jr. Park to, I think, Broad and Fitzhugh, near the DA's office, where they painted in the street, as well as the intersection of Broad and Fitzhugh, where they painted in the street, in addition to Exchange and Main Street. At about 10:30 p.m., there were less than 50 protesters at the Martin Luther King Jr. Park, and the protest disbanded last night at around, I want to say, about 11:30, and there were no arrests made last night, no issues. And that kind of concludes the reports from the last 4 days of the protest.
All right, Chief, before we open it up to members of council, there's just one specific question that gone unanswered. I didn't seem to find it, and maybe I looked at it, but what is the cost? What's been the cost of this up until this point in time?
So the cost from the fiscal year 2019 to 20, which is from May 29th to June 30th, is about $470,000. And since July 1st to September 13th, this fiscal year, it's about $1.1 million. So the total cost from May 29th up until September 13th is $1,603,000, $442.43. So $1.6 million.
That $1.6 million from 473 this time last year, is that correct?
No.
Is that what I
No.
understood?
No. So
What's the difference between, go ahead.
So from May 29th to
I'm
June
sorry.
30th, we spent $470,000 from May 29th to June 30th. From July 1st to September 13th, we spent $1.1 million. And combined from May through September 13th, it's $1.6 million.
Wow.
And that includes callback, completing assignment, meetings, tours, and projects.
Thank you, Chief. At this time, we'll open it up. I think the first hand I saw, Lachey, then Mary Lupien, okay? And then Mitch Gruber. Lachey, Mary, Mitch.
Thank you very much, Vice President. Chief Singletary, I'd just like to ask, I received reports on the night that the protesters went to Child Street, which is on the north side. There was dogs on location. If you can please speak to that, and why was there dogs on location, if that was true?
I believe on Child Street, there were no dogs on Child Street.
Okay.
We had spoken with the state police and we've been working with them ever since the concerns came up.
Thank you for that clarity. So can you please confirm that there's no dogs during any of the protests since that request has been made?
There have been no dogs that have been visible, to my understanding, since that request has been made.
Thank you very much, Chief.
Councilperson Lupien.
Well, I have one follow-up question about Saturday night's protest, but I also wanted to know, I submitted several questions ahead of time. Chief, did you get a chance to review those?
Yes, I can go through those now if you would like.
Okay, let me just ask the question about Saturday's protest. There was I've seen pictures of I know it's called a Bearcat, but to the naked eye, it looks like a tank. Can you discuss the decision to deploy that on Child and Wilder?
Yes. So the New York State Police utilizes the Bearcat along with their deployment. As the mayor and I had talked on Saturday night, that's how they deploy with respect to their SORT team and their mobile field unit. As you may not be aware of, but maybe a couple months ago, they had an incident in Buffalo where a state trooper was run over and I believe had surgery due to his pelvis, and other injuries that resulted. And I think there is a pending lawsuit right now against the city of Buffalo as a result. So that's how they deploy to protect their personnel from vehicles coming upon them. That night on Saturday, we did have a vehicle breach the traffic control point. I believe it was Child and Campbell Street. That vehicle was stopped, and that is when the decision was made to bring the Bearcat to protect the personnel at Child and Wilder Street. And that is why the Bearcats were brought forward.
Okay, at this time, I want to know if I get Councilmember Gruber's question, and then can we go back to going over Councilperson Lupien? Can we go back to getting to the rest of your questions for the record, if that's okay, before we get to other council members, if you agree with that?
Sure.
Okay. All right. So Council Member Gruber, sir.
Thanks. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. So on several occasions, but I think most notably on September 4th on the Court Street Bridge and this past Saturday at the intersection of Child and Wilder, the announcements that RPD has made has said that protesters have gotten too close and that a buffer of space is needed to be established. I want to understand why in those occasions the choice made by RPD has been to deploy chemical weapons on the crowd and forcing them to back up rather than giving ground themselves. What is the kind of tactical decision there?
Well, that night, again, as the protesters were within several feet from officers, even probably 3 feet from officers. Several protesters had bullhorns. As you can imagine, if you're on the front line of that protest, having a bullhorn in your ear can be an officer safety issue for the officers. Our officers don't have any type of hearing devices within their ears to protect their hearing, and they also have to listen to the commands that are given to them from behind by the sergeants as well as through the radio. So that's one option and one consideration. Second, with regards to officer safety within the personal space of the officers, it's unknown what is going to happen with regard to someone being that close to an officer. With the number of incidents that we've seen across the country and the number of objects that have been hurled and thrown at officers, we just don't know what to expect. So when the decision was made to push the crowd back, we did not use any type of chemical munitions when nothing was being thrown at the officers. It was a verbal move back, and the officers advanced forward without using any type of chemical munitions at the thing. So it's just officers stepping step by step, moving the crowd back to create some sort of distance. Again, overall, the officer safety issue.
Can I just touch on the hearing element with relation to the bullhorn, because the LRAD, am I saying that right? The LRAD device came out on Saturday night at Child and Wilder, and my understanding is that device is probably many times louder than any bullhorn. So what was the decision-making process to bring that device out and to deploy it the way that it was done? Because that would also be an officer safety issue in addition to a community safety issue if people aren't prepared to deal with that decimal level.
So obviously, the long-range acoustic device machine that you're talking about, referring to the LRAD, what we try to do is make announcements with that, verbal announcements. You're in the street blocking traffic, you are subject to arrest for disorderly conduct and the like. So the first order would be to give a verbal order for the crowd to move back. Then there was the long-range acoustic device, the tone, that would give an indication for the crowd to move back. These are all things, less than lethal options, that we would like to utilize before we do any type of hands-on or use any type of chemical munition whatsoever. So that is the purpose of the LRAD, in addition to utilizing the verbal commands. We also deploy it at a safe distance with regard to the officers not being in front of the LRAD.
Okay.
Vice President, what's my last question? I promise. I'm just trying to understand. According to the, I could be mistaken. Maybe Councilmember Lupien put this in her written questions, but it seems as though there's a lot more communication coming from RPD, whether it's the Twitter account or the press releases. And what I'm not. And by the way, I should say that I think that's a good thing. The more communication is a good thing. The part that I'm not understanding is that there are some nights where the communication from RPD is that there are things being thrown at RPD, at officers, but there is no use of pepper balls and tear gas. And then there's other nights where there are things being thrown, and like on Saturday night, and there is pepper balls and tear gas being deployed by RPD. So again, I'm trying to ascertain what is the kind of line in the sand, because if it was just things being thrown at officers, then there probably would have been some escalation on Friday night when there wasn't. So is that just about officer discretion, or how is this being ascertained or figured out by people on the ground?
Well, I mean, the people on the ground are the ones that are having objects thrown at them. There were times Saturday night when I was in the command post and officers reported via radio that they were having things hurled at them, rocks, bottles, water bottles, eggs. Though I know several times officers will call out for note-taking purposes and to log it that there were several eggs that were being thrown at the officers. Those officers did not take any type of response whatsoever when the eggs were being thrown. Again, we try to take a measured response, but when you have several persons shooting rocks, bottles, eggs, then I would not expect the officers to sit there and take it for the propensity for injury to be high with regard to those things being hurled by several people at the officers. When there's one egg coming at an officer, I mean, certainly, I'm sure nobody likes to be hit with one egg, one rock, one bottle, but we take a measured response. And as those officers were taking those one by one, we did not take any type of action whatsoever. However, when there is a barrage of objects thrown at officers, we have to respond.
Okay. Thank you, Councilmember Gruber. Thank you, Chief. Before I get to you, Councilmember Patterson, I'd like for the questions that Councilperson Lupien presented to you, Chief, if you could read those and the answers to the record, please, sir.
Sure. The first question was, please list all the weapons used against protesters. And my answer is the tools and resources that we utilize are less lethal options, and they are the pepper ball launching system, OC spray, which is capstun, tear gas when we have incendiary devices that are being thrown and launched at us, which is commercial grade fireworks, and we haven't utilized any tear gas since last Saturday, September 5th. The long-range acoustic device, which is what we just talked about for announcements and tones. The second question, provide an update on requested footage of surrounding the arrest of Adam Green. I believe our office is working on setting up a date for such with Councilmember Lupien, and we will work on a date so you can view any footage that you would like, as that is the purview and right of the council. The third question, who is in charge of the RPD Twitter account? Has there been additional resources utilized for PR? The Chief's office is in charge of the RPD Twitter account, and there have been no additional resources utilized for any type of PR. The fourth question, is there a way to calculate the ammunition expended, pepper balls, tear gas, mace canisters, etc., during protests so far. And we are in the process of attempting to obtain such, and we hope we should be getting back to you on that. The next question, how was the decision made to position officers at the end of the Court Street Bridge on Friday night, resulting in the dangerous pinning of protesters on the bridge with cars behind them as officers fired on the crowd? Such was part of the overall operational plan to not allow access points to the public safety building, as there are infrastructure in the building, and what we've seen across the country with regard to protesters wanting to take over the safety building. We've seen areas where in Minneapolis where they set the building on fire and made entry into the building. As we always do, the plan was revisited to determine the safe and most practical approach for appropriate and the mayor.
We're losing you, Chief. You're breaking up a little bit, sir.
How can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Is this better?
Yes.
Okay. I think we get some feedback, and I think maybe somebody just muted everyone's phone. Sounds better. So I'll repeat the answer with regard to how was the decision made to position officers at the end of the Court Street Bridge on Friday night, resulting in the dangerous pinning of protesters on the bridge with cars behind them as officers fired on the crowd. Such was part of the overall operational plan to not allow access points to the public safety building, as we've seen across the country where some agitators have wanted to take over the public safety building, set fire to the public safety building. And as you know, the public safety building not just houses the police department, but the city IT infrastructure, fire department, and the like. So the police department is just not the only ones housed here. As we always do, the plan was revisited to determine the safest and most practical approach for appropriate action. When we had several communications with many people in the community to allow the protesters to come to the public safety building, not the optional plan that we wanted as a department for tactical reasons. However, we did adjust, and we did for such. The start of the plan was Sunday, September 6th, after meeting with Pastor Brown, the mayor, and that plan was initiated. The next question, did any of your officers report any of the colleagues for misconduct over the course of the weekend? Up to the moment, I am not aware of any. The next question, who was in charge of the police response outside Spiritus Church on Saturday night, which resulted in anyone leaving behind being fired upon? As chief, I'm in charge. I'm the overall, operation. I'm in charge of the overall operation. I was in contact with members of the church that night to ensure they were able to leave the church. Throughout that night, I was in contact with people who were at the church, as well as individuals who were not at the church. Do you have a suspect in the hit and run and where mace was deployed? If not, there are videos showing the license plate.
Go ahead, Chief. Chief? All right, so it seems like we're having a little technical difficulties here. We'll check in with the chief. You guys that are around that table, can you hear us okay? Somebody wave your hand and see if we can hear you. Can you guys hear us? We can't hear you, but can you hear us?
Vice President, it appears that they aren't able to. In the interim, would you like to move on to the outstanding questions for the mayor and then rejoin with RPD when they're there?
That's fine. That's fine, BJ. Thank you.
I'd be happy to. The first question we received a response was related to the HR options for officers being moved from command staff into their previous positions.
Cassie Demps, our HR director, will go through the response and let you know exactly what happened in the approval process.
So the personnel actions that took place, the retirements as well as the voluntary demotions are at the sole discretion of the appointing authority, which would be the chief. The 4 individuals that had rights to retire had their years of service, which is 20 years plus each one of those individuals, and therefore they could opt to retire at any time, which they did. HR has not received confirmation letters on those retirements. We were informed by in the news that when that came out, and we are waiting for the confirmation paperwork to process those. HR received confirmation on the voluntary demotions, the 3 individuals that are being voluntarily demoted. We received that information, that paperwork on Thursday, September 10th, reviewed that documentation and verified that they were eligible at the discretion of the appointing authority, which is the police chief, to be voluntarily demoted. They were demoted and then returned to their acting status in their current positions. So they could be demoted. Deputy Chief Simmons to police lieutenant, Mark Muir to police captain, and Henry Favor to police lieutenant. All of those actions could take place based on, after review with the HR department, based on Civil Service Section 75 law.
Thank you. BJ, do we have RPD back on the line?
We don't yet, but we still have a couple other questions that I can read.
Okay, go ahead. I thought I just heard them call in and then they were muted. Check, if you check, Chief, are you on the line? 1 second, BJ. Just wanted to make sure he's there.
I am communicating with the chief another way, and he said that they're still trying to get in.
Okay, all right, go ahead.
Willie, can I ask Tassie a follow-up on that on that answer?
Sure.
Or just clarification. So I heard, thank you, Tassie. I heard you talk about the acting role. So the individuals who have taken a voluntary demotion did so because the chief has given them, because the chief ultimately allowed for that to happen. So that's step 1. And then the chief can also put them back into the acting roles that they're in now, again, at his discretion. So even though they've taken a demotion, they are currently at an acting level, and this is all at the chief's discretion. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Vice President, I'm back in.
Okay, I will get right back to you in a second, Chief. We have 2 more. We're going to administration, then we'll come back to you to finish up Mary Lupien's questions and answers. Thank you, sir. 1 second. BJ?
Certainly, Mr. Vice President.
Thank
The
you.
question was, what is the mayor's ability to issue directives? For example, name covering on officers' badges. Do you have the ability to direct the officers the ability to direct officers not to do this as they are public employees? Please also delineate if there's a difference around mandating that a name be visible or if a badge number remain visible.
We will share with you the information. The Corporation Council they did an extensive background and review and a search of law, and they have a memo that's prepared, but I will have the Corporation Council give you a brief overview, and then I will email you this report after we are done with this briefing.
There's 2 sections of General Order 350. One section requires that uniformed officers wear name tags, and one section of General Order 350 requires that officers wear badges. Any deviation from the general order is only subject to further direction of the chief. It's our understanding that the deputy chief issued a verbal waiver of those during the times of these demonstrations for the personal safety of officers. Council has the capacity to adopt legislation which requires name tags and badges in all circumstances. The problem with that is under Article 20 of the collective bargaining agreement and the Taylor law, council could adopt an ordinance, but there would be no repercussions based on violations. So no discipline could be imposed. However, we know that the mayor can issue directives to the police chief, and the police chief would then issue directives to the officers. So we think that the better way of doing it, other than city council adopting an ordinance of largely symbolic effect, the mayor council could work with the mayor and the mayor could work with the chief to require what identities would be available. And if we deemed it prudent that name tags be covered for personal safety and all the situations that are going on, you could negotiate that, but you could also negotiate the fact that badge numbers that were a little less directly traceable to the officers would need to be displayed at all times. There's a pending bill in the state Senate that would require both pieces of identification to be displayed at all times, but the bill is currently in committee. So we think that the best course of action at this point would be to work with the mayor and for the mayor to work with the police chief.
Hey, Katie, can we mute 6182, the chief, I believe, just for a second, please? Thank you. BJ, is there a final question for administration, Mayor?
There was one of similar note. In what instances are you as mayor able to issue an order over the chain of command or issue directives? And the other was to provide any update as they come in regarding the transition of RPD leadership after September 29th.
I'll be giving that information as soon as it's available. And we've already answered this question. I can direct the police chief and work with the police chief, but the police chief is the one that has to give the directive to the chain of command.
Okay, Chief, you can continue on with Mary Lupien's questions and answers. After that, Mike Patterson, you will have the floor, sir. You gotta unmute the chief there. There you go. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Vice President. Just 3 more questions left. Do you have a suspect in a hit and run where mace was deployed? If not, there are videos showing the license plate. You know, officers did respond to that incident. We did open an investigation. The investigation is ongoing, and we can follow up with you on that once such is complete. So the next question is, can we issue a preservation order for all city drone and surveillance video, including blue light cameras, also personal phones of command staff, call logs, images, text, and radio traffic? It's my understanding the law department is facilitating such and is working on preserving the video that's been requested. How were the recent cases of federally charged individuals handed up to the feds? And the answer is, in consultation with the Rochester Police Department, the District Attorney's Office, and the U.S. Attorney's Office, the U.S. Attorney's Office determines if they have an interest in the case. If the actions fit the elements of a federal crime, the U.S. Attorney's Office makes a decision to adopt the case, which is a practice that occurs frequently. And that was the last question that was provided by Councilmember Lupien.
Thank you. Councilmember Patterson, sir, you have the floor.
Thank you. Chief, have you established a formal mechanism of communication with protest leadership?
Mike, you have robot voice, brother.
I don't know.
Vice President, I did hear his question.
Okay, great. Go ahead, Chief.
Yeah, so throughout the summer, since May 30th, there have been times where I have communicated with some members of various protests representing various entities that have done protests. I won't say any names for the protection of those individuals or just not to release their identities publicly. So yes, I have been, as well as third parties who have tried to be mediaries in between as such, and such has been successful. So yes, the answer to that question is yes.
Okay. I believe this question is going to be more for the administration than anyone else, and it's a follow-up question to Council Vice President Lightfoot's question regarding the cost of overtime. And so, yeah, specifically where the cost of overtime, specifically the protest activities over the last 2 weeks. So if you could get us that information, that would be useful information to have. Though I do appreciate the answer that Chief gave, I don't think it provided specificity that I would be looking for.
So the question, if I understood it correctly, Councilman Patterson, to the administration, is what is the specific cost of overtime over the last 2 weeks since the protests have been happening, specific to overtime? if you don't have that answer, I know there was a larger general number that was given to us by the chief, and we appreciate that. But I think we're looking for a more specific on just overtime during protesting, a specific number. Is that correct, Mr. Patterson?
So I think that, and I'll have the chief answer clearly, but we have had protests going on in the city of Rochester since June, late May, June. And so this is a combination of all of the protests that we've had in the city. And at this point in time, that is $1.6 million. And that's from that June up until just this past, just last night, I believe. But Chief, you can answer that question on the dates, and if last night or the night this weekend was included in that number.
Yes, the mayor is correct. The overall number is $1.6 million. I know Councilmember Patterson wants the last 2 weeks. We can try to work on that with regard to the last 2 weeks, with regard to the time period. Yes, like the mayor, there has been protests since May 30th of this year that have involved overtime. Since May 30th, we've had the one, I think May 30th was the night where we had, the violence in the city that took place all across the country. I think since May 30th, up until as of recent, we have not had any instances of violence with respect to what's occurred probably within the last week and a half to 2 weeks with regard to agitators. So we have facilitated the protest ever since May 30th, moving forward until the last week and a half. So we've, for several months, facilitated protests with regard to marching downtown or assembling and things of the like, and have worked with organizers or protesters who have wanted to take 490. So up until this last week and a half, the Rochester Police Department has facilitated those protests, and they have been peaceful up until the last week and a half.
Chief, who bears the cost of the $1.6 million?
The taxpayers.
The taxpayers of the city of Rochester.
Okay. Mike, Mr. Patterson, you're very difficult to understand you, sir. It's very difficult. We'll come back to you, Mike. Any other council members? Councilmember Pio, Councilmember Evans, any other council members that may, I will come back to you, Mike, that have anything that you, Mike, try turning off your Wi-Fi. Is there any other council members? Evans, Pio?
Yeah, my question is, were the arrests that were made, do you know off the top of your head, Chief, if these people were local or if they were from?
The ones from Saturday night, I believe they were all local. The 3 arrests that we made Saturday night, they were local.
Thank you.
There were previous, Councilmember Evans, there were previous arrests that we did make that involved individuals from as far away as Massachusetts, Dansville, and other parts of the state and the country.
Thank you, Chief. Councilmember Pio?
Most of my questions have been answered already, but do we have a plan for cleaning up Martin Luther King Park with all the graffiti, or are we just keeping it there until things settle down?
Administration, Madam Mayor?
So it was made, the park, into a chalkboard, as it was part of a design by Sean Dunwoody, who's a local artist. And so you can, for the park, the grounds have been made into a chalkboard for people to be able to leave their messages and their thoughts down there. And so we will continue to monitor and make sure that it is available for that purpose.
Councilmember Patterson, then Councilmember Gruber. Councilmember Patterson, sir, let's see how you sound.
Can you hear me?
A little better, yes, sir.
Okay, well, if you can hear me, so my request was that of the 1.6 million, if you could disaggregate that over the last couple of months, so we can see what the trend line is. I get it. You had a high spike of cost earlier on. Probably you had a lull. You had an additional spike. If you could just show that, give us information, that would be appreciated.
Let me ask you to do this, Councilman Patterson. Stop moving for a second and ask your question again, please.
Okay, so disaggregating the $1.6 million cost, can you send that to us?
We got it. Thank you.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you, sir. Councilmember Gruber, sir.
Yeah, thank you. So again, I want to go back to the fact that the RPD has been certainly more transparent through things like social media, but I am still struggling to understand some of the decision-making process. And I appreciate what you said, Chief. I think you used the word barrage earlier, but I look at on 9/8, the RPD Twitter account says that protesters have started throwing rocks at officers. There was no pepper balls or tear gas deployed that night. On 9/9, the RPD Twitter account says that protesters have taken down a first set of barricades. There was no pepper balls or tear gas deployed that night. So again, the questions I've been asking since we started these briefings is trying to understand what the line in the sand is, because I think this is really important. I mean, I don't believe there should really be a line in the sand, because I don't think that we should be deploying the pepper balls and tear gas on these protesters. But I'd like there to be consistency from the RPD around what it is that triggers the use of pepper balls and tear gas. So 9/8 and 9/9, I just look back to those Twitter reports from the official account. I'm trying to understand, if rocks were thrown that night and there was nothing deployed, what makes it so that rocks are deployed on a different night and like on Saturday and things are deployed? What's the decision-making apparatus there?
Councilmember Gruber, I think, based on what you just said, I think you don't want to paint us into a corner. You don't want us to have a consistent response for one rock that is being thrown. We have to take a measured response, and each situation is different. When we came to the public safety building, I'm not going to get into tactics with regard to publicly, so we can have a conversation kind of maybe offline with regard to specifics when it comes to tactics and officer safety. But I think to answer your question now is that if there is a rock being thrown at officers who are spread out, which is what we try to do when we readjust it, it's easier for an officer to try to, I guess, move out of the way of the rock. But when you have 30 officers standing close to one another, the propensity for them to be struck by a rock is great. It also talks about distance, how far we are from the projectiles that are being launched toward the officers. So I think the response has to be measured. The response has to be looked at differently. And, because when I say you don't want to paint us into a box, I don't think you want the same response for each and every time something occurs. And I think that shows the restraint. I think it shows that we are looking at situations and we are assessing situations. So I think that's the answer to your question.
Okay, and that the decision is ultimately being made by someone, not the people on the ground, not the folks who are out there getting a rock or a bottle thrown at them. That decision is being made somewhere in command and being based on what the things you just said, Chief, based on the distance, based on the volume, based on the spacing. That's a decision someone's making behind the scenes and then directing folks whether or not to deploy the tear gas and pepper balls. Is that correct?
It's a combination of both. It's commanders on the ground relaying information back to us. As the last 2 weeks, we have been very measured in our response, and we have been restrictive when it comes to who in the chain of command can authorize what. and that is the climate that we are in, us as a command staff knowing the climate that we're in, and I think the officers showing restraint on the ground. So it's communication back and forth between the officers on the ground, the field commanders on the ground, supervisors, as well as the command staff within the command post.
Okay, we're wrapping up. We're gonna have very brief questions from Councilperson Lupien Patterson. We're gonna turn it over to close us out with Madam President. So it will get Lupien, Patterson, Madam President. Thank you.
Thank you. I just wanted to clarify. So at one point you said, you know, in regards to officers getting things thrown at them, that, you know, something like, you know, I understand if they're not willing to take it. And that, I guess, made me feel like maybe there are some circumstances where officers would take it upon themselves to either, you know, move into the crowd or deploy pepper balls. Can you clarify, can an individual officer themselves make that decision, / have they done that in the past?
No, I think part of this is just the lack of education that I think you all have with regard to coming up to not knowing what goes into the training with regard to mobile field force, and as most of the public does. So I think it would be a great opportunity for us to kind of maybe educate you all with regard to how the mobile field force training actually kind of works, and that's understandable. So the officers are show much restraint. It's a uniform process. There are supervisors who are behind the officers on the line, who are giving directions, who are there to ensure that no officer makes any motion outside of that line, obviously for a number of reasons, officer safety and to assure discipline on the line with regards to behavior and actions that are taken and response to those behaviors and actions that are taken from the crowd. So the answer to your question is no. We have supervisors who are monitoring all the actions, who are ensuring that no officer tries to advance and move forward. Again, there are situations that are made on the ground. There are situations that are made in conjunction with the command post, back and forth. So it's kind of back and forth.
Councilman Patterson, sir.
Okay, so Chief, I certainly understand that nobody wants anything thrown at them. And I certainly would encourage people to not throw anything at the police. But do you consider an egg a comparable threat to officer safety as a rock or a water bottle?
I mean, that night, Saturday night, there were several eggs that were thrown at the officers, and we took no action whatsoever. So we take those things into account. There are a number, I mean, we've had, I think, 8, 9 officers that have been injured throughout this. Some have a broken finger, some have had lacerations, some have been burnt by incendiary devices. So we've had a number of officers that have sustained some sort of injury with regard to what's being thrown at them, particularly not knowing what's in the liquid that's being thrown at them when it comes to, it could be, I don't even want to begin to think what could be in a liquid capacity form thrown at officers. But those officers have shown good restraint on the line. Again, no one wants to have anything thrown at them, you know, and the officers obviously, you know, they deal with such until, again, you have numerous objects being thrown at you that can increase the likelihood for someone to get hurt.
Also, along those lines, do you have shields? Do you have enough shields?
You guys want to speak to shields?
Yeah, we don't have enough shields, number one, and we don't deploy with the shields. If you're thinking of a large shield, because that only gives you a certain level of protection, nothing over the top, nothing incendiary, nothing of that sort. So the shields have, you know, some protection, but I think the overall thing is one of the reasons we create distance is very important. If I can get outside somebody's range that they throw something at us, it's safer. That's part of the reason we keep distance, which shouldn't be overlooked here. And the other thing is, quite frankly, nobody should be throwing anything at us, and we wouldn't be throwing it at them, and we'd be all set.
Well, no one is going to argue that point with you. We all agree that no one should be throwing anything. And we all agree that no one wants to see an officer injured. And you know, any officer that's been injured
you know, we are sorry to hear that that has happened. That is not anything that anyone would encourage. And we certainly would hope that the protesters would police themselves. And from what I and they have been doing that as of late. There's always going to be some folks who are going to act a fool, and apparently protest leadership in the community has been getting after those folks and pushing them back and shutting that down. So the protesters are to be commended on that. The restraint that the officers are showing, that's to be commended. We're sorry that any officer would be hurt in the line of duty. And, you know, but at the same time, I think part of our oversight function is to make sure that we're hearing what y'all are doing, and we're just seeing what's going on and making sure that we are creating that space for free speech as safely as we possibly can.
Thank you, Mr. Patterson. Madam President, would you close us out? We're getting ready to adjourn this briefing. Madam President, are you there? If not, okay, I'm getting ready to close this briefing. Thank you, Chief. Thank you, Command Staff. Thank you, Madam Mayor, and your staff and administration. Thank you, all of the council members. Until we meet again, love, peace. See you when we see you.
Thank you.
Thank you.